Okay, so in section 3 here, we're going to talk about these concepts of inflation and deflation. Okay, so again, in this whole chapter, we're learning these concepts that are going to be pivotal, necessary when we build our macroeconomic models in the subsequent chapters. Okay, so we just finished talking about the aspects of employment and the labor market conditions in an economy. Now we're going to talk about prices in an economy. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. So maybe you've heard these concepts before. Inflation. So this is anytime there's a sustained increase in the average of all prices of goods and services in an economy. Okay, so when the prices of things in the entire economy go up, that's inflation. It's probably hard for most of you to relate to inflation because you're relatively young. But if you talk to a parent or a grandparent about the prices of things when they were your age, they will tell you that prices were much lower. Okay, so basically what we're seeing there is that prices over time have slowly increased, and so that's what we're talking about when we talk about inflation. Now, the opposite of that, which we don't really see, is deflation. We do see it very infrequently. The last time we did have deflation in our economy was during the Great Recession. But we do not see this as frequently in our economy, but this is basically the opposite of inflation. It's when prices in the economy go down. Okay, that's deflation. Related to these concepts is the idea of purchasing power. So purchasing power is the value of money for buying goods and services. Okay, so purchasing power varies with prices and income. So for example, suppose that your income, your money income, the dollar amount that you receive on your check stays the same, but the price of a good goes up. This basically means that your purchasing power has gone down, right? You're getting the same amount of money, but you can't buy as much with it because prices have gone up. Okay, so that's the idea behind purchasing power and the distinction between money income. So basically what happens when we have inflation and prices in the economy go up, if you're making the same amount of money while this is happening, your purchasing power is going down. You're not as able to buy as much stuff with the same amount of income as you were when prices were lower. Okay, so that's the nature of purchasing power. How much can you buy with the money that you have? And this leads us right into the discussion of nominal versus real values, right? So nominal values are the values that we are used to seeing, prices expressed in today's dollars. So nominal income is the dollar amount on your paycheck. Nominal prices are the prices that you see expressed in dollars at the grocery store or any other place where you purchase goods or services. And this is different from real values. So this real values are expressed in terms of purchasing power. And so real values have been adjusted for inflation. Okay, so just as an example of this, back in the late 60s, a brand new Ford Mustang cost somewhere around $6,000. Okay, seems pretty cheap, right? Oh man, a brand new Mustang for $6,000. Today, a brand new Mustang costs somewhere around $30,000. Okay. Now, so you might be thinking, oh man, Mustangs are so much more expensive than they used to be. That's true if you're talking about the nominal price of a Mustang, right? The dollar value has gone up by 400%. It's increased fivefold, right? But incomes have also increased fivefold approximately. So really, in terms of the real price of a Mustang, the real price of a Mustang between the late 1960s and today actually has not changed very much. In fact, it's basically the same. The real price of a Mustang is exactly the same today as it was in the late 1960s. So that's the nature of this difference between nominal versus real. All right, so since inflation is going to be an important concept for us, we want to be able to make sure we can measure it in some way. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So how do we measure the rate of inflation? So the measurement of the rate of inflation involves something called a market basket. Okay, so think of this kind of like a shopping cart. It's basically a representative bundle of goods and services, and so we're going to talk about different market baskets in a second. But in any case, generally speaking, a market basket is a representative bundle of goods and services. Another important aspect of measuring inflation is something called the base year. And the base year is just a point of reference for comparison of prices in different years and other years. And so it's pretty much an arbitrary year. Doesn't really matter which one you pick, but once you pick one, you want to stick with it, and that is going to remain your basis of comparison, right? So the base year. All right, so we need to understand these things so that we can calculate a price index, which is going to allow us to measure rates of inflation. So a price index is simply going to be the cost of today's market basket of goods and services expressed as a percentage of the cost of the same market basket during the base year. Okay, so for example, the formula is basically the cost of today's market basket divided by the cost of that same basket of goods and services in the base year, the year of comparison, and then we multiply that by 100. So if goods are twice as expensive as they were in the base year, twice as expensive today as they were in the base year, this ratio, this division, this quotient would be 2, and then we'd multiply it by 100 to get a price index of 200. Okay. Now, what this also means is that if today is the base year, then this quotient would be 1, right? The cost of the market basket today divided by the cost of the market basket in the base year. And if that base year is today, then we would basically have the same number on the top and the bottom, which would give us 1. We'd multiply by 100, and we would get the price index of 100. So what this means is that the price index in the base year will always be 100. Okay, so keep that in mind. The price index in the base year is always 100. Okay, so here's an example, a numerical example we can go through to illustrate this. Okay, so we've got 2 commodities, corn and digital devices. And the market basket is going to consist of 100 bushels of corn and 2 digital devices. So that's our basket, okay? And that's not going to change. It's going to remain the same for any given year, okay? And then the next thing we need are the prices in the different years that we're going to compare. So we've got the price in 2009 of those 2 things. So a bushel of corn is $4 in 2009, and a digital device is $450 in 2009. The next thing we need to do is calculate the cost of each of those things at those prices. So we simply take the quantities and multiply them by the prices. Okay, so in column 4, we see that the cost of the corn would be $400, and the cost of the 2 digital devices would be $900. Just multiplying quantity times price. And then if we add those together, we see that the cost of the entire basket in 2009 is $1,300. Okay, then we move on to column 5 and look at prices in 2019. So we can see that the price of corn doubled from $4 to $8, and the price of digital devices actually went down by $100. Okay, so interesting. One increased, the price of corn increased, while the price of digital devices decreased. Okay, we do the same thing. We calculate the cost of each of those things by multiplying the quantity times the price in 2019. So we've got 100 bushels of corn times $8. That's $800 is the cost of the corn aspect. And then we take the 2 digital devices, multiply that by 350, and that gives us $700 is the cost of the digital devices. So that the total cost of the basket, the whole basket, is $1,500. Okay, so the cost of this basket has gone up by $200, which means we've had some inflation. Now, if we want to calculate the price index in 2019, and assuming we're going to use 2009 as the base year as the year of comparison, the basis of comparison. Our price index is going to be 1,500 divided by 1,300, and then we're going to multiply that by 100 to get our price index. And so our price index is 115.38. Now, the reason we use 100 as the price index in the base year is because now with this new price index in 2019 is that it's very easy to see what the percentage increase since 2009 was. It's simply 115.38 minus 100, which is the index in the base year. So 15 prices have increased by 15.38%. Okay, and that's very easy to see, and that's why we use the 100 as the price index in the base year. It's because if you give us a price index in any other year, we can simply subtract 100 from that, and that gives us the percent change. Okay, so what are some real world price indexes? One that is very common is called the Consumer Price Index. And this basically is calculated using a market basket that consists of things that the average consumer purchases. There's one that's pretty similar called the Producer Price Index, and this is calculated using a basket of goods that the typical or average producer would purchase. There's another one called the GDP Deflator. Now, this one's interesting because it includes all goods and services in the economy in the proportions that they are produced. So this is probably the broadest and most useful one when we're talking about GDP. And then there's another one called the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. This one's not as common, but I think that this is the one that the Federal Reserve Bank uses, if I'm not mistaken. So these are just a few examples. There are others, but these are probably the most common and most important ones. Okay, so let's talk about the CPI a little bit more. It's a statistical measure of a weighted average of prices of a specified set of goods and services purchased by wage earners in urban areas. So really, this is very specific in terms of people that live in urban areas. So it overrepresents people that live in cities and more urban areas, and it underrepresents farmers and rural area people of the population. So again, like I said, it's calculated using a market basket of goods and services of a typical or average consumer, thus the Consumer Price Index. The Producer Price Index, it's the statistical measure of a weighted average of prices of goods and services that firms produce and sell. So this is used as a short-run leading indicator before CPI. So just a little bit on that. A leading indicator is an indicator that tells us where the economy is heading. So it's sort of out in front of where the economy is now. So it tells us where the economy is heading. And this is used as a short-run leading indicator. So where will our economy be in a month or so? And in addition to that, there are actually even more specific PPIs. So there's a PPI for foodstuffs. There's a PPI for intermediate goods, so not goods that you and I buy as consumers, but that businesses buy. And then there's a PPI for finished goods, which are the goods that you and I would purchase, right, as consumers. The GDP Deflator. It's a price index that measures the changes of all prices in the economy of new goods and services produced in the economy. So it does not include things that have been produced in the past. It only includes new goods and services. So again, it doesn't include used items, things that are not new. And again, this is the broadest measure of prices. It reflects both price changes. And it also reflects the public's market responses. So how do people change their purchasing behavior in response to those price changes? So this is probably the broadest and best measure of prices in the overall economy. And then this last one, the PCE index, statistical measure of average price using annually updated weights. So it's constantly updated based on how consumers change their spending. And again, this is the primary inflation indicator used by the Federal Reserve Bank, the organization responsible for our money supply and monetary policy. All right, so we'll wrap up this section with a policy example. How high one's price level adjusted income is dependent upon where one lives. Okay, so a lot of times people's wages or other aspects of their expenditures are adjusted for inflation based on where they live. And so if you look at places such as California or New York or New Jersey, those areas, those regions of the country have much higher prices than the overall price level in the U.S., the overall U.S. CPI. And so to classify individuals as rich, it would require us to consider the differences in price levels of different regions or different states. So, you might have heard of cost of living adjustments. That's basically what we're talking about here, right? So, if a person makes $100,000 a year, that's going to their level of income, their real purchasing power is going to depend on prices in their region. So someone making $100,000 a year here in Georgia is much better off than someone making $100,000 a year in New York City, for example, because prices in New York are so much higher. All right, so here's a graph sort of illustrating the differences in CPI between different states. So this is in comparison to the United States overall CPI. So as we can see, states like Hawaii, New York, New Jersey, California, the prices in those states are much higher than the average in the U.S., whereas states like Mississippi and Arkansas and Missouri have much lower prices compared to the United States as a whole. And therefore, they have negative differences there. Illinois, right in the middle, is very close to the average in the prices in the United States. All right, another example. This is an international example, how variations in prices of imported items can push apart the PPI and the CPI. So the PPI, the Producer Price Index, does not reflect changes in prices of imported production inputs if they do not immediately translate into changes in domestic producers' prices. But because the CPI includes the prices of imports, it adjusts immediately. So the differences in between the way PPI and CPI is calculated, PPI will not immediately reflect imported items, whereas the CPI will. So for example, following a significant drop in prices of imported goods and services, these two price index will tend to diverge, at least initially. So they'll tend to separate from one another. And to wrap up this section, we'll look at this graph here. So this is inflation and deflation throughout history in the United States, going all the way back to 1960. So we can start here. In 1960, we see that the Civil War was going on right around then, and at that time we had very high inflation in the United States, upwards of 25%, right? Which means that something that cost $100 this year would be $125 next year, right? So that's the nature of 25% inflation. Sorry. And then we can see shortly after the Civil War, there was a long period of deflation where prices were actually going down 5% a year. And so we had either deflation or zero inflation for a long period following the Civil War. And then we started to see inflation again just before World War I. And again, right after World War I, very high inflation. So as you can see, it looks like wars tend to push prices up. Excuse me. Which makes sense because the government is competing for resources with the rest of the economy during wartime, right? So that's why we see inflation during periods of war and immediately after. And then we can see that again, shortly after World War II, we had some other periods of deflation. So one of those is the result of the Great Depression, right around 1930. But ever since the Great Depression, there has been very, very little deflation. Ever since the 1930s and early 1940s, we've pretty much only had inflation. The closest we got to having deflation was during the Great Recession, right around 2008. And then again, looking at some other things here, we see that war is still associated with inflation, but then there's this other peak, this high peak of inflation that doesn't seem to necessarily be associated with a war. And what this was the result of was a period of time in the mid to late 70s called stagflation, where the economy had very high unemployment and at the same time had high inflation. Usually those two things don't go together. Usually when we have high unemployment, like we did in the Great Depression, we have low inflation or even negative inflation, which is the same as deflation, prices going down. But that was basically the result of oil embargoes. There was a very high price of oil during that time. And since oil is energy and energy is needed to produce basically everything, that caused the price of everything to increase dramatically. But since then, since right around the late 80s, early 90s, inflation has been kept pretty well under control, less than 5% for the most part. And recently it's been pretty close to zero. All right, that concludes this section. I will see you in the next section.